Hey everybody, it's EJ from eyedesyn.com, and today I'm going to be showing you how to get a kind of liquidy 2D linear transition inside of Cinema 4D. So we're going to be making a transition that's going to look kind of liquidy, or a wipe that is very 2D in its nature. You can actually see on my screen right here is that I have the shoe that is actually it, that comes in a free Sketch Toon model pack that I'll provide information in the tutorial description. So go grab that. And what's actually going on is I have my first off my strokes kind of fading on. I also have my strokes actually offset a little bit, so I got a little bit of this like print offset kind of look and style to this piece of line art animation. And then I have this kind of liquidy, kind of tearing kind of effect, wiping and wiping off, or wiping on and wiping off this shoe model. So this is what I'm going to be going over today, is 2D transitions, 2D linear transition is inside of Cinema 4D, line offsets, and fading up your Sketch Toon strokes, all in Cinema 4D. So let's get started here. Alright, so I got a shoe model and I pulled that from my eyedesyn free Sketch Toon model pack. It is free, as it says in the name, and it's a collection of 18 models, 3D models that you can use that are optimized for use with Sketch Toon and applying Sketch Toon flat 2D styles to your 3D objects. So I got a collection of 18 here. You can grab them from the website, from my website, eyedesyn.com, and I'll post a link to the actual download page in this tutorial description, so check it out there. But this is the shoe model that I'm using, so you can actually grab this model and do the same exact thing and follow along. But what I'm going to do is create a wipe that kind of wipes this shoe on, and at the same time I'm going to have the strokes, the outlines on this guy kind of fade on as well. But first thing I want to do is, let me actually go in here and delete the animation that I got already going on here so you can actually see the strokes. So the first thing I want to go over is how I got this kind of print offset. So you can see my strokes don't exactly align to my object. You can see there's a little bit of like color bleed going on right here, and this is actually a very simple setting in Sketch Toon. So I'm going to turn on interactive render region here, and so you can actually see what's going on. And to get this kind of print offset look, what you're going to do is go into the adjustment tab of your sketch material, and you have all these options. You can resize the strokes, you can actually adjust where the ending point is. There's a lot of really cool options in this adjustment for adjusting your strokes. So you can see you have this kind of tapered, kind of gradual edge kind of getting chopped up here. You can create really cool stylistic strokes using all of these options here. But the main one that you want to pay attention to with getting this print offset look is this screen offset button right here. So what this is going to do is you're going to basically want to pay attention to the X and the Y here. And what these values do is offset your strokes from your object in the X and Y direction. So you can see if I have 0 values here in the X and Y, everything looks exactly as it should in this scene here. All the strokes line up perfectly with the 3D edges of my 3D objects in here. But once you start adjusting these values, you can see that that is now offsetting my stroke in the X direction. You can see actually in my little coordinate little icon down here that X is actually a little bit slanted to the side, since I'm using a parallel camera right here. So you can see that it's kind of pushing it in the X, but it's actually X towards the screen because you're doing screen offset. So really, I guess it is independent of how your coordinates are kind of lined up. So it's in the positive X, I can go in the negative X, then it'll go way over here, and let me just put a value of 3 in there. And then you can also adjust in the Y. So if I jack up in the positive Y, You can see it goes down. If I go in the negative Y, it'll go up, and you can actually see what's going on in preview in your little window up here to see exactly what's happening up there. So that's basically how you can get this screen offset. So the start and the end is again just kind of offsetting the start and the end of each stroke. So this is kind of taking the first part of the stroke and moving it and offsetting it, and you can see that it really doesn't give that good of a result, because when you're working with a lot of objects in your scene, you start messing with this value, it just starts making everything kind of janky. Maybe that's maybe that's a style you dig and you want to use that. But for this, the most important things I use is the X and Y screen offset, because it achieves this really nice kind of printing press kind of color offset kind of deal, where your strokes are just a little bit off center from where your actual objects is, and it creates this really nice effect that you're seeing in a lot of animation these days, and even illustration work. So screen offset, that's how I get that done. The next order of business is creating this nice gradient, alpha gradient kind of wipe. And the way I did that is actually fairly simple. I'm going to create a new material, and then I'm going to name this just alpha wipe. And I'm going to turn off the color and the reflectance. And I'm going to turn on alpha. So first thing I need to do is I'm going to create a gradient, a black and white gradient to use as a matte to help motivate this wipe on and off actually. So I'm going to create a gradient. You can actually see in my little sphere here that I'm getting a gradient happening, and it's a smooth gradient, but what I want to do is actually have a very no interpolation whatsoever. So I just want black and white, no gradation or no ramping from black to white, just it's either black or then it just goes directly to 100% white. So what I'm going to do is create this wipe where it actually wipes on and then wipes off. So black means it's not visible, white means it's visible, and then I'll actually need another black knot over here where it's not visible again. You can kind of just eyeball this, or you can actually, do 33% and actually have these positioned in kind of like a third of each, dividing this gradient into thirds. So these are spaced kind of evenly. So what you'll notice is what you'll need to do, first off, is you need to actually apply this to all the objects in your scene. And to do this, you just go ahead, select all of your objects. Make sure you get them all in here. So I think that's about it. And you actually apply this on top of the materials you already have in your scene. So what I'm going to do is go and select, right click, and just go to apply, and you'll see that all of my gradient alpha ramps have been applied. And the important thing is that it's applied as the material furthest to the right. If you have this material applied under or to the left of your original material, it's not going to work. You can actually see that gradient kind of go away and be overridden by your original material. So keep that in mind. Let's see, I think I can get rid of that material. Or I'll keep that. Okay, so let's see. Now what we need to do is you'll actually see that this isn't actually creating a alpha at all. What we're doing is just painting these black strokes onto our shoe, and that doesn't really look all that great. So what we need to do is, number one, you can actually see in our little preview window here that what we're getting is just a white or a black stripe here. And this is due to the fact that by default, if you don't have any other color channel or anything on, it's just going to have it's just going to be a black material here. So you can see if I just turn this off, it's just a black circle. So what I actually need to do is go into my transparency channel and turn that on. And I don't need the internal reflection or exit reflections at all. I just need this to be a transparent material. So you can actually see that by turning transparency on with this alpha gradient, that we're actually creating those black stripes actually are now basically alphas. You can actually see through the images there. And since this gradient is applied based on the UVs of your object, we're getting these little black and white gradient maps just kind of tiled all across our object. And that's not what we want. We actually want just one gradient applied over the whole entire span of all of our objects. And then have it wipe linearly. And what we'll need to do for that is actually change the type of gradient we're using from one that's based on the UVs of your materials of your objects, the UVs of your objects, and one that's independent of any of that. So what we're going to do is use a 3D linear gradient. And what this is going to do, this updates right here, is you can see we have a stripe going right down the middle of our object. And the first thing we actually need to do is invert these colors, because we're actually having where white actually should be visible texture, we're actually getting the opposite. So what we're going to do is just invert this, and we should then get exactly what we expect. So we have so black is nothing, so it's over here. So we can see right through, so that's full alpha. White is where we can actually see our image, and then it goes back to black where we can't see our image again. And we'll just turn cycle off here, because cycle actually deals with UVs and mapping and stuff like that, and we don't need it. So basically how 3D linear gradients work is based off of 3D space. You can actually position a gradient in 3D space. You can see the start and the end. And if I turn off my interactive render region here, we can actually see our grid, that the start position, these values, is X, Y, and Z. So, and then end X, Y, and Z. So right now our gradient starts at negative 100 in the X, and you can see this is my X axis kind of going at a diagonal here. So my start is right here, right at this one line right here. This is negative 100 in the X. And then my end is positive 100 in the X. And you can see that's about right here. So when I render, you can see exactly this gradient being laid out. Whoa. Let me go interactive render region. There we go. So what you can actually see is, once this renders, is that this gradient is laid out between negative 100 in the X and positive 100 in the X. And you can see our white or stripe going right down the middle of it. That's our matte, where we can actually see our texture. So if we start adjusting these values to be closer together, so if I move this to 0, so it'll be 0 in the X, this will actually squash our gradient to just 0 in the X to 100 centimeters in the X. And if I make this a bigger negative number, that means our gradient will start here, or actually start over here and end here. So you can see that more of the gradient is pushed over to this area over here. So it's very kind of abstract. You can't visually see exactly what's going on, and I don't like that kind of setup. So what I like to do when using 3D linear gradients is actually linking the start and end positions to nulls. And you can actually do this with some very, very easy peasy, simple Xpresso. So what I'm going to do is control these gradients and set up these start and end positions of our 3D gradients and control them with nulls. So I'm just going to create a null and rename this to start. And what I'm going to do is then go to my start null and just select all of the position values here. So all of them are highlighted, and I'm going to right click and go to expressions and say set driver. So I want these values to drive some other values in something else, and those values are going to be this start position. Remember, this is start XYZ, so I'm going to have the position XYZ of my null control the start XYZ of my gradient. And to do that, I just right click on the start here, go to expressions, and go to set driven absolute. And then what you'll notice is that my start null is 0, 0, 0, and now my start in my gradient is 0, 0, 0 as well. But you'll notice once I start actually moving my gradient around, you can see that I'm moving the Z, I'm adjusting the position in Z. It's now reflecting those same values in the 3D gradient. So that's really, really cool. And it just created an expression here. You actually didn't need to write any Xpresso at all, but you can basically see that this automatically set up and just kind of linked those two values together of the start position of the null to the gradient start fields here in our gradient. So we're going to do the same exact thing with our end coordinates here. So we'll just create another null and rename this end. And again, do this really simple, easy Xpresso setup of right-clicking. Make sure you get just click on the P and you'll select all of them, and just right-click, set driver, and then make sure end is selected. Right-click on the word end and go to set driven. So now you'll notice that the end null is now controlling the end coordinates in our 3D gradient. So now what we can do is move both our start and our end and actually see this white stripe or alpha, or black and white matte, kind of going through our objects. So what I want my animation to be is have it start from nothing. So if I render this frame right here, you'll just see the outlines. So none of our textures are actually wiped on yet. So once I actually keyframe these nulls, you can actually see a little bit in the viewport. You can actually see this little checkerboard kind of texture, and that kind of signifies the alpha. So when I render this, you'll see that we actually have an alpha right up here. So this stripe going through it is the matte passing through in 3D space and affecting all of our objects. So now what we need to do is we just need to kind of extend the start and the end position here, so it's actually covering, so that white portion is actually covering the entirety of our object here. So now that's fully visible because we're now mapping this white part of our matte to the 3D space that our shoe object is positioned in the scene. And then all I need to do to animate this is just set some keyframes for our start and end. We'll just need to set some keyframes in the Z, but you can actually record them for all if you want. And then I'll have both my start and end nulls kind of, actually I did this wrong. Let me go back. So I actually want, so this is fully visible. I actually need the gradient to be over here, so now it's invisible. Now we have the black part of the matte, or the black part of the gradient mapped on the shoe. So you see I render that, and you don't see anything. And then I'll actually move my nulls so it actually makes everything visible. Hit a new keyframe, so you see there's no more of that checkerboard, transparent stuff on my shoe. And then I'll have another keyframe, so there's a hold here, and then I'll just move my nulls to have this wipe completely off. So I just moved my black and white gradient stripe through my object, set some keyframes. Now you can actually see, hopefully you can see actually the checkerboard material being passed through. Now it's white, and then it ramps through again. So hopefully you can see that. So this is fully visible, and then we have our, see this little line here with the checkerboard, that's the start of our matte that's coming through and wiping all of our textures off. So this is all well and good. Once you have that all animated and keyframe correctly the way you want it to keyframe, we can actually go a little bit further to make this a lot more interesting, and that is by adding a little bit of turbulence to our gradient here. So we can turn just a linear gradient into a more interesting kind of grungy gradient here if you want. You actually see it's a little bit just like noisy, just very small noise, but we can actually scale the noise down. And I never understood why bringing a percentage down actually makes the scale of the noise bigger, but the lower this value is, the bigger your noise. So you can actually see a little bit bigger noise. And I'm going to bring the octaves down so there's not so much detail in our noise. So you can see a little bit going on there. Let's see, let's go right here and render this. So let me turn on the interactive render region here, and you can adjust the turbulence. You can bring up the turbulence up even more, and you can kind of get this looking almost like it's liquidy, kind of washing over this 3D object, which looks kind of cool, especially with all the layers of 3D here going on. So you see the outer sole, this red, and then you actually see the inner sole, which is just this white, and it actually creates this really nice, cool, almost liquidy effect. And this frequency is actually how fast this turbulence is animated. So if I right click and say animate this preview and turn up the frequency here, you can actually see the turbulence kind of waving around. And if you bring this value up, this will actually be like animated noise wiping through your scene. So you can kind of play with that and see what looks good. I think just a very subtle low value in here actually works pretty dang good, just for some subtle movement as this wipes across. And then the final thing I did, so that creates this kind of liquidy wipe on. Let me turn off that animation window there. And again, you can adjust the size of the gradient if you would like by scaling this, adjusting the scale percentage here. So you can create some really cool kind of liquidy transition effects like this right here. You can actually see a lot more, almost looks like it's tearing a little bit like kind of cloth or something like that. So you can have a lot of fun experimenting with this. But then the final thing was just animating the opacity of our strokes. So we don't want our animation to just start with outlines. We actually want our outlines to kind of transition on as well, and kind of transition on the same time as the alpha, the gradient ramp kind of goes through. So you can see the start of it happening right at the top of our shoe. And what we can do is actually go, and instead of going to draw on our strokes, we can actually have our opacity fade up all of our strokes and then control that whatever way we want to. So we can actually reset this to default long to short, or since our gradient's coming from right to left, we can actually have our stroke order go from right to left. And our method, you can just do single strokes or all strokes, whatever you want to do. And then the draw speed, I like to use completion for this, and then you can just animate the completion of all of your strokes animating and fading up by this completion percentage. So I can hit a keyframe for completion. I'll just move this here and then just have my completion all the way down to 0. So you'll see no stroke going on. And then as I go from the 0% completion to 100%, you actually see our strokes fading on one by one in our viewport here. So I'll have that animate on and then have this animate off by going from 100% completion back down to 0. So as our gradient wipes off, we can actually have our strokes animate off as well. So let me go and adjust this. So this is our gradient, our start and end keyframes here. So I just kind of want to line that up and have that synchronized with the wipe. So now, once you've set all of that up, and you render it, you put it in the oven. 45 minutes later, you get a little animation kind of like this. So I had the strokes fade on, I have my alpha white coming through, kind of creating this cool kind of tearing or liquidy kind of wipe on with the turbulence in that gradient as it wipes across. And then have my strokes fade on and fade off using the completion percentage on the opacity on my stroke material. So that is how I created this cool little 2D kind of liquidy transition kind of thing going on, and using the screen offset to get the kind of offset printing kind of look to my objects. So if you have any questions, be sure to hit me in the comments. Hopefully you guys followed all that. This is a lot of fun to play around with. I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with. Remember to grab all those models in the free Sketch and Toon model pack on my site. Play around with all that stuff. If you make something, be sure to share it with everyone. Really like to see what you guys are coming up with. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next tutorial. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.